My name's Anna May, and I'm a forester and the 4th generation in the Starker family. The Starker Forest started in 1936 by my great-grandfather, T.J. Starker, and it's been in the family ever since, going to my grandfather, Bruce, and then my dad and uncle, Bart and Bond, and now me and my brother and a couple of my cousins are also involved in the business. The Starker Lecture Series started as a way to honor TJ as well as Bruce, because they're both really interested in forums for debate and new ideas in forestry. After they both passed away, the family thought it'd be a good way to carry on their legacy.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone to the 2022 Starker Lecture Series. My name is Julie Woodward. I'm with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. It's my pleasure to be here at the College of Forestry today. And thank you for all of you for being here, and for those of you online for joining us this afternoon. Oregon State University is in Corvallis, Oregon, and it's located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River on the Umpqua Band of the Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. The theme of the 2022 Starker Lecture Series is Women in Forestry and Inspiring Leadership. And we want to focus on women who act as agents of change within forestry and forest product sector, as well as within their communities. The College of Forestry graduated its first woman student, Pauline Bartos-Sandez, over 75 years ago. And today the college celebrates the accomplishments of all women who are students, faculty, and alumni in our community as it strives to become a more inclusive space for all. This series will explore the triumphs of women, as well as the myriad of challenges they face in the forests, mills, research labs, and beyond. This year's Starker Lecture Committee is made up of an ad hoc group of all women who work within various fields of forestry and within the college. And I'm honored to get to co-chair this series with Jessica Fitzmaurice, our event and outreach manager at the College of Forestry, or otherwise known as Superstar. So thank you to the Starker Forest and the family for being a sponsor and our gracious hosts throughout this series. Today we'll hear from Edie Sonny Hall, founder of 3 Trees Consulting. She'll talk about the road less traveled and why women in forestry will save the world. To end the series, we also will have a one-day capstone workshop on May 10th. We encourage you all to register and attend. Throughout the day, we will explore all aspects of forestry with a focus on women's leadership and the future of women in the forestry and the wood products industry. We're pleased to have over 18 speakers that'll join us from a variety of careers on panels and various discussions throughout the day, including a resource fair. So check out the website, the registration, and more information on the lecture series website. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Edie Sonny Hall. And Edie brings over 25 years of experience and connections developing sustainable forestry strategies and policies at the state, regional, national, and international level. She has a PhD in forestry from the University of Washington and specializing in forest carbon accounting and life cycle analysis, and a BS in biology from Yale University. As founder and principal of 3 Trees Consulting, she works across all parts of the forest sector, from nonprofits working with small woodland owners to large companies and associations to government in the US and internationally. She grew up in the Northeast, worked as a wood quality researcher for International Paper in Southern Georgia, and then moved to the Pacific Northwest for a career at Weyerhaeuser. So she understands the differences across the regions and forest ecosystems, markets, and policy. In addition to a professional and academic career in forestry, she's a family tree farm grower, growing trees in South Carolina, and she lives in Seattle with her husband, 3 children, dogs, and an assortment of chickens. So thank you for joining us here, and we look forward to hearing from you today. Please join me in welcoming Edie.
Glad you didn't, I didn't say how many chickens I had because one just died a couple days ago. So now we're down to 4. Anyway. Well, I have to do something first. I have to share my screen. I have to get rid of this. Slideshow. We got it? Hey, is everyone here? I am super excited because I got to go out in the woods for a little bit today. So it makes it any day out in the woods, even though it was wet and windy. There were no tornadoes though, so all was well. So I'm excited, and I'm really excited to be here. So Dean DeLuca, Starker family, Oregon State faculty and students and friends, it is an honor to be here today. I am your neighbor, even though I'm your neighbor from the north. I'm from Washington and also the University of Washington, go Huskies. I have been a long, long admirer of Oregon State. In order to tap in to my inner Oregon, I recently reread my favorite book of all times, Sometimes a Great Notion by Ken Kesey. I thought that this would be the perfect book to inspire me for this talk. Its writing evokes strong images of coastal Oregon forests and powerful rivers, and it's about a logging town and a family that never gives an inch. But after rereading it and after feeling emotionally dragged through the ringer, I realized that unless I wanted this talk to be a Greek tragedy, I would have to draw inspiration elsewhere. I mean, it is still an incredible book. Every sentence is flawless. So if you haven't read it, please do. And it leaves you just so sad. And I did realize one thing. Ken Kesey was not a feminist. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if Hank Stamper's wife, Viv, was able to speak for the Stamper family. Would a compromise have been achieved? Would the town have survived? Or even if before that, if Myra, Henry Stamper's young, smart, Stanford-educated second wife, was actually able to have a career, would her life have ended in tragedy? And it got me thinking, what happens if we put the women in charge? I don't think that Sometimes a Great Notion could be changed. And maybe the problem all along was that Ken Kesey went to the University of Oregon. But the one thing that the book did convey was the power of Mother Nature as depicted by the mighty Wakanda-Aga River. And it is the power of Mother Nature as harnessed through trees that I will be devoting much of my talk to today. Before I talk about trees and women, I am going to talk about directness. I have been told by my friend from middle school, who runs a company analyzing words called Textio, that the world perceives women's directness and men's directness very differently. She, who by the way has her PhD in linguistics and is a total rock star, got the idea for her company based on analyzed performance feedbacks of hundreds of company employees across a wide range, albeit mostly tech companies. And she discovered that in these feedback reports that when women exhibited traits of directness, they received feedback such as abrasive, bossy, strident, aggressive, while those same traits of a male performance review resulted in words such as leadership, boldness. So there you have it. I may already be coming across as too strong, but I hope that in time, this talk will be valued for its message and words and not filtered based on who is delivering the message. So when I was first asked to speak at this lecture series, it was the fall of 2019, believe it or not. It's a long time ago. And to put this in context, it was coming on the heels of the Me Too movement. I give a lot of presentations, but when I was asked to talk about my story and provide some thoughts on women as change agents, I thought, God, these people at Oregon State really know their stuff. They know what they're doing. I was like, I have a lot to say. And I was so happy to be able to tell my story. Well, a lot has happened in the last 2 years. And I questioned whether or not it was my story that really should be told. And why? Well, because although I am a woman, I am absolutely the product of privilege. I am not only so white that my skin burns really easily and I have to get moles removed, but I have direct ancestral ties back almost as far as Jamestown. And ironically, my family story has land and history at its center. I can tell you where General Burgoyne marched behind my family's cabin near Lake Champlain in upstate New York during the Revolutionary War. And I can tell you where the original New York, New Jersey state boundary was behind the house in which I grew up, because my dad would go out for fun and try to find it on weekends. But the story that has been told to me and that has been passed down from generation to generation is exceptionally one-sided. And I discussed this with a good friend who pointed out that just because my family has only focused on European-centric the last few centuries, it doesn't mean I suddenly stopped talking about that. It just means my story is incomplete. So where does my story begin? Well, actually, ironically, it does begin in Europe. I was born in Paris, France. And my family, consisting of my mom and my dad, and not one, not two, but 3 older brothers, lived in France for 5 years for my father's job. And I was born in the last year. Though my parents were American, my father's dad had come to the US from Denmark in 1917. And he came from a family of farmers. His grandfather started the first cooperative concept in Denmark. So land and the concept of land stewardship has really been a part of my family's heritage. When we moved back to the US, we settled in the same house that my dad grew up in, the house that my mom still lives in today, with files and furniture that has collected over 90 years. I've missed a slide. Oh, well. Well, I'm not going to spend time talking specifically, I'll go back to this slide, specifically about the multiple places that I call home, other than to say that they celebrate the diversity of trees in the United States, the diversity of forest types. Some trees have been purposely planted on abandoned agriculture land in South Carolina on the grounds of the Shakora and the Waccamaw. Others have naturally regenerated around old stone walls of failed agriculture land in upstate New York on the grounds of the Mohawk. And still others have filled in and burned after multiple decades of fire suppression, and now more recently fire, in the north central Washington of the Okanagan Territory of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville. Being a family tree farmer is perhaps why I pursued a career in forestry. And it certainly has provided an important perspective. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to this. So as you may have guessed by now, I love trees. I love trees so much that I named my 3 kids after them. But it is the scale of forests and landscapes that I spend most of my career focus. So don't ask me anything about pruning or pest damage, because I'm just as good as your average amateur backyard enthusiast. And I can now call myself a woman-owned small business owner. I work with organizations of all types, nonprofits, industry associations, government, individual companies, to help bridge the gap between science and policy and management. I am also a woman tree farmer with some land that has been in my family for generations and some that has been recently purchased with my husband. Through my jobs and my land and my hobbies, I have studied trees and forests at many different scales, from global projects with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development down to measuring the microfibril angles in wood cells when I worked as a wood quality research scientist. I have spent the last 20 years focusing on climate change and how forests and forest products can help reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases. I also follow closely how climate change will, and in many cases already have, impacted forests around the world. I could spend the next while telling you dire predictions of desertification, increased fire and disease, species loss, and these are real and important. But I am an optimist at heart, and I will now directly, boldly claim that forests will solve all the world's problems. And now I have to tell you why, how, and what the heck women have to do with it. So the why is easy. We need to use trees as a renewable resource. Currently, the world extracts 100 billion tons of natural resources annually, which we use for society's needs, from housing to transportation to food. The quantity of natural resources extracted annually has increased 12-fold between 1900 and 2015. And these are expected to double again by 2050. Currently, 74% of annual resource extraction are of non-renewable resources. 40% of global carbon emissions come from the building sector, and 8% of global emissions come from concrete. However, much of society's needs can be met with renewable alternatives. Almost anything that is currently made from fossil fuel, from chemicals to packaging to plastic composites, fabric, personal care items, can be made with renewable resources, including wood. You need to build a house, use wood. Not only are forest resources the solution to resource scarcity, but they can play an essential role in providing low carbon and even negative carbon products and energy. The Food and Agriculture Organization found that the global greenhouse gas substitution benefits of using more wood-based building materials, just 25% over the trend line, would be 1.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2050. In addition, there's carbon that's stored in that wood, and that would increase mitigation benefits by another gigaton of carbon, which together gets us over 10% of the way towards meeting the reductions needed to meet a 1.5-degree temperature stabilization. And there is also a lot of evidence that the demand for forest products has a positive impact on forest carbon. In fact, countries with the highest amount of industrial roundwood harvesting have the most stable or increased carbon stocks. The opposite is also true. Countries with the lowest demand for industrial wood products experience issues with deforestation, which is land use change out of forestry. So the US, globally, to put in context, has 7% of the land area, 8% of the world's forests, and actually produces double that, or more than double that, almost 20% of global industrial roundwood production, which is the largest. It's the global leader. And the United States is also currently growing more biomass each year, meaning that it is a net sequester of carbon, even with harvesting for wood production. But we'll talk more about that later. Okay. So now the how. How are forests going to provide the products that we need to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases? Okay, I think we first need to go back to the basics of the biogenic carbon cycle, which I have learned is not intuitive to the average American, average person, let's say. In graduate school, I helped teach a class to explain basic forest wood concepts to kindergarten teachers. It was actually awesome. We recreated, or tried to recreate, the experiments that led to the understanding of photosynthesis. That started with Jean-Baptiste von Helmholtz's famous willow soil weight experiment in 1631. or in the 1630s, and then ended with Joseph Priestley's bell jar experience. We failed on that one, by the way, in 1731. So though all of us have seen this equation that's up on the right here, the photosynthetic equation, it is not something that is easily translated back to conceptual reality. In that same course, we showed the teachers a video of MIT students on their graduation day. Has anyone seen this video? Okay, you guys got to type in photosynthesis at MIT on YouTube. It is awesome. So, and no down on MIT. They're very smart in their own way, but not everybody is an expert on the photosynthetic cycle. So they're on their wedding, or not their wedding day, their graduation day, and they're asked, like they showed, there's a picture of a seedling and then a picture of a log, and they're asked, hey, this seedling is super light and this log is really heavy. Where does the weight of that log comes from? And so, they authoritatively explain, well, there's minerals in the soil, and, someone might have mentioned water, and maybe someone mentioned sunlight. And the interviewer says, well, what if I were to tell you that the weight actually comes from the air? And they say, well, no, that's impossible because, weight has no air. Well, guys, it's the carbon molecular weight 44, carbon dioxide molecular weight 44 that's in the air that then turns in to the carbon that forms the walls of the cells of woody materials or any plant material. And that carbon is captured. So that is one side of the equation. But now we also have to explain the other side of the equation, because upon combustion or decay, that carbon then reforms back into carbon dioxide and goes back into the atmosphere. It is a two-way street, and it is influenced by both nature and humans, and that is super important. So what happens to this two-way street at different scales? You've probably seen this Keeling graph measuring CO2 in the atmosphere at Mauna Lea in Hawaii. And if you squint, you've noticed that there are these annual squiggly lines that go up and down. Well, those are literally the difference between leaves falling off deciduous trees and decomposing, emitting carbon dioxide in the fall in kind of the northern hemisphere, because that's where the majority of deciduous forests are, and trees growing the following late spring, summer, and taking in carbon dioxide. And in any given year, all of these things are happening all across the landscape. In fact, the gross flux from land to the atmosphere is huge. This graph, which is a few years old, shows that gross photosynthesis is on the order of 123 gigatons of carbon. And gross fire and respiration are on the order of 109 gigatons of carbon. These fluxes are an order of a magnitude more than annual fossil emissions, which are about 7 or 8 gigatons of carbon. So think about that. Global annual fossil emissions, 7 to 8 gigatons of carbon. Gross sequestration and emissions are 17 times more than that. However, it's the net flux that we are interested in. Is more CO2 leaving the atmosphere and going into the vegetation, or vice versa? And ultimately, what we're actually interested in are atmospheric greenhouse gas emissions declining. Fossil fuels, by the way, are a one-way street. So a gross emission equals a net emission, and there is no natural return out of the atmosphere on a time scale that we are interested in. And just, by the way, I'm going into my sciencey lecture here just to make all the carbon pools covered. I want to make sure you know the ocean. That's also an important piece. The ocean is also a two-way street. It can be a source or a sink of carbon dioxide. But the ocean is largely based on chemistry, on diffusion. So CO2 will move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So the more CO2 that's in the atmosphere, the steeper the gradient and the larger the sink into the ocean. And that is why the ocean is currently a sink, and it will keep getting more and more. That's why the ocean is getting more acidic and killing all the coral reefs. Okay, so back to the land atmosphere system. The net impact is influenced by all sorts of things, by tree growth, mortality, insects, fire, land use, both into and out of the forests. And these can be both natural and human induced. And just to show this graph on the far left, you will see an extension of the forest cycle, which the International Panel on Climate Change describes as the transfer of CO2 originally sequestered by vegetation into a product pool, such as furniture, similarly to when carbon is transferred from a live tree to the litter and the soil carbon in the pools on the land. So at a landscape scale, even without human interventions, forests are always in flux. So sometimes trees are growing and taking in CO2 and converting to cellulose, and then sometimes they're dying. And they're dying due to insects, fire, wind, drought, blah, 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 and releasing CO2 back to the atmosphere. And you have probably heard by now that forests in the US are a net sink, meaning that there is more carbon going into the forest than is re-released by decay or combustion or harvest. But I want you to know that this large sink is very much a function of past management and current demand. So this graph shows net carbon sequestration over time in the US. So between 1600 and 1750, net sequestration was 0, big goose egg. Okay, so that meant that on any given acre, there were absolutely trees that were growing. And then on other acres, there were trees that had fire or were being shifted around or were being grazed, all sorts of things. And at the end of the day, in the US, it just happened that this all balanced out. Then we basically converted all of the East Coast to ag land, right? And you can see this green is a function of the acres of land and forest. So we had a huge decline, a huge land use change. And that happened between 1600 about the late 1800s. But since the early 1900s, forest land has actually been stable or increasing. And in addition, we have started replanting trees when we harvest them. So since the 1950s, our US forest lands have been a considerable net sink of carbon. But actually, this sink will not continue forever. And in fact, the Forest Service predicts that by 2060, the US as a whole may lose its sink entirely. And this will be driven by fire and disturbances in the West and development pressure in the Southeast. It is really important to note that humans have always impacted land management with burning, land use change, and forest products. We heard summaries of fire and other indigenous practices in the three speakers that came before us, or came before me in this series. And these are really important to bring into the carbon discussion. The shift away from fire and then the subsequent shift to fire suppression has resulted in a significant increase in biomass in parts of the interior West, on the order of 2 to 3 times more per acre. This carrying capacity is not resilient, and it is setting us up for large, uncharacteristically large fires, you guys are all aware, and large returns of CO2 into the atmosphere. I also want you to understand that harvest demand does not have to lead to a carbon loss. In fact, the opposite can be true. This graph shows growth and mortality in harvest in the US since the 1950s. When harvest level increased by 35% in that time, inventory increased by 50%. So what can we do? The only fixed area is land. The Earth has 10.6 billion hectares of workable land, and that is the only fixed asset. We absolutely can have a world with healthy, resilient, productive forests and provide renewable resources to our growing population. But we have to be more efficient, and we have to look at the entire system. Given that our goal is to reduce atmospheric gases, our focus should be on designing a global system that puts less greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and takes more greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere. We must use systems thinking when we look at carbon. This has not always happened in the past. I will give you 2 examples, and I promise the charts are almost over, and then we get to the pretty pictures. Okay, this is a terrible slide, but I'm trying to paint the picture that this is super confusing. So the first comes from confusion with terminology. It is nearly impossible, nor I would argue relevant, to try to distinguish between human and natural impacts when it comes to the biogenic carbon cycle. Yet we are constantly trying to do that. In fact, the latest IPCC report spends about 4 pages trying to describe why different methodologies yield tremendously different results regarding the impact of the AFOLU, the agriculture, forest, and other land use, for those who don't know that acronym, sector on greenhouse gas emissions. You probably heard things like, globally, agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector is responsible for approximately 25% of net anthropogenic greenhouse gases. But you may have also heard that the global land is a net sink. What's the deal here? What's the difference? Well, in some bookkeeping models, only things that clearly humans do, cut trees, land use change, those are counted as the anthropogenic contribution, and the rest is considered natural. So you cut a tree on an acre, and that would be considered a human impact, but the growth of the trees on that same land is part of nature. Now, in other methods, such as the national greenhouse gas inventories, the complete actions on lands that are not pure wilderness areas are considered managed. And the difference between these 2 models yields not only a considerable difference in numbers, but also in perception. This is darn right confusing to everyone, especially to those who don't intuitively have a grasp on the carbon cycle. The second one comes from carbon reporting and carbon targets. Many companies are now making strong commitments to reduce greenhouse gases and ultimately to become net zero by 2050. And how land plays a role in all of this is still unclear. There's a lot of discussions. But there is a lot of discussion and a lot of money being thrown down at trying a bunch of things out. For example, some say, well, only removals, which are sequestration, are important because we have to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. But removals on what time scale? What is the risk that that tree will be subject to insects or fire? What if you have just caused a shift to cutting trees further away from a mill or into another country with no environmental regulations? Or worse, what if you are now building with cement or steel? Did you actually reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases? This is a complex problem, and it requires systems thinking. We cannot independently separate the land from the technosphere. And spatial and temporal considerations are important. And by the way, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about carbon, which is an ecosystem service that is supposed to be simple, let's remember all of the other incredible ecosystem services our forests provide. The latest IPCC mitigation report attempts to communicate this systematic throughout the document and creates this chart that shows that, oh, by the way, the land sector also impacts the building sector and transportation and energy and industry, as seen on this chart here. But let's be clear, this report is almost 3,000 pages long and is very technical. So why did I just spend so much time explaining the complexity of the biogenic carbon cycle? You guys are foresters. You intuitively understand, but others do not. My husband works in tech. He is the most brilliant person I know. Ask anybody. But he is also a marketer, and he wants to simplify. And all the tech people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing, and they also want to be perceived as doing the right thing. And sometimes the full explanation about systems and trade-offs, well, it's too complicated. But this is too important to get wrong. So we have to stand up for our forests and we have to educate. And we need all hands on deck, including more diverse viewpoints, more focus on collaboration, more focus on symbiosis, or the anthropogenic term, the win-wins. And this is where women can play a key role. So what are the strengths of women? Women tend to be optimizers, not maximizers. Some people call this the win-wins. Others call it trade-offs. And more negatively, multitasking. Women often tend to have compassion and to seek cooperation. Typically, women have to do a lot of this and maybe have more practice. Have you ever seen a mom on a typical day? She's juggling work, arranging carpools, scheduling dentist appointments 3 months out, and also deciding which are the essential actions to meet short, mid, and long-term goals. She's also caring for her parents, her kids, her community members, and she is making sure that no one is fighting. She tries hard and sometimes fails. Now, I am not saying that every one person needs to do everything, but the system as a whole needs to consider everything. And I can also tell you that if you want a fully vetted decision, have a woman be responsible for that decision. Why? Because every single male on the team has unconsciously paid more attention to the review process and has offered numerous suggestions. Many are truly helpful, some are not. Don't get me wrong. It is not a bad thing, and it makes a better product, as long as the vetting does not stall or result in a subpar decision. And I actually love to get feedback. I really do. And I very much appreciate the strength of the final product. But if I am wondering whether a decision has been thoroughly vetted, I am going to feel confident if a woman has been put in charge. There is also something, generally speaking, this is a total generalization, that women have less of. And maybe I am being a little too direct in saying this. Egos. This is important because teamwork and cooperation are what are needed to harness the power of trees. Not one person is going to solve this. So what do women need to work on? Confidence and courage. I'm going to tell you a little story as promised. I was always very good at math and science. And I also had this crazy lucky middle school experience where I went to a very small co-ed school and my class was overwhelmingly dominated by girls. We were smart and we were athletic, and at recess we would play very physical games of tennis ball keep away boys versus girls, and it was always really close. And we were just as even in the classroom. I carried that confidence through high school. There wasn't anything that I couldn't do just as well or better than the boys. I also went to summer camp in Maine for many years, and I honed my skills as an outdoors woman. Using only an axe, a knife, and a wet log, and a few matches, I could make a fire and boil a cup of water in under 7 minutes. My brothers, who were all older than me, and while they were superstars in sports, I wasn't too shabby myself. And I got way better grades than they did, mostly because I studied. I was in all the advanced math and science classes, and I really loved biology. I got into Yale, and I was headed off to dominate the world. I didn't know exactly how, but I knew I loved forests and the environment. And I arrived at Yale a week before classes started, and I met my roommate. She already had books open, and she was studying for an exam. What? What possible exam was there that happened even before classes started? Well, she announced to me that she was going to be a science major. She was going to be majoring in molecular biology and biochemistry, to be precise. And they had their placement exam to map out her 4-year course of study. I thought, well, crap. I guess my hope of majoring in science is out the window. And just like that, I became a history major. I spent a year, my confidence was shaken, and I spent a year taking history classes, math classes, and random science classes, which were really fun. But my sophomore year, I started to rethink my choice of major. I really liked science. Why was I not doing it? So I switched majors my spring of sophomore year, which for anyone who has majored in a science, you know that means taking a lot of catching up. I doubled up on organic chemistry and biology labs while also playing a varsity sport. And I was busy, but you know what? I could do it. I certainly wasn't the best at any of my pre-med classes. I wasn't even one of the best, but I got through it. And then I got to take fun classes at the Yale School of Forestry graduate school, and I found my calling. I was very close to having my lack of confidence at a new, intimidating school dictate my entire career trajectory. Had I not had the courage to give science the good old college try sophomore year, I would likely just be an avid reader of books about forests. And now, maybe someday, I will write a book myself. So I was asked for advice on how this was all going to work. I was asked to give advice to the young women who are going to lead us through this mess. And I'm going to focus on 4 key areas: courage, communication, mentorship, and balance. And by the way, I think these are important for everyone, not just women. Courage. First off, you have information in your brain based on your set of learned knowledge and experience. And that is important to put on the table. It is important because likely it is not already on the table. You have to speak up, even if you don't know entirely what the answer is, the entire answer. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we could all clarify our statements with, I feel 80% confident about what I'm about to say? Some people, by the way, absolutely do this. I think it's a great practice. So speak up, even if you don't know everything. Communication. Figure out how you best communicate, and more importantly, what your weaknesses are. Do you only provide information when asked? If it's hard for you to find the courage to provide that information, you've got to find an ally that will be the butterfly. I will tell you that I am an introvert. And if someone asks, I can talk for hours, clearly, about things I know, But I don't necessarily proactively offer this information. And I have discovered that I need to align myself with people who are extroverts. I have found great partners and allies, and I have so appreciated the different strengths of different people. There is not one person who can do everything. So partnerships and teams are essential. I am working right now with some incredible colleagues, men and women, who all step up to get the job done. And it feels incredible to be part of working teams. And so what you really need to do is find good teammates. Next, mentorship. I have had the fortune to have had tremendous mentors over the years, even though I forged a very unique pathway. You don't have to be a clone of your mentor. I think this is a misconception that a lot of people have. Mentors are there to provide an outside take on your decisions. But remember, your mentors may have gone through their career decisions at a different time than you. They might not always be right. When I was in graduate school, I had already worked as a research forester for a forestry company for 2 years. And my graduate studies were done through the lens of applied research. How can I take what I learn and apply it to actually improve management? I thought that I would get a master's degree and perhaps an MBA, and I would go back to the private sector and, obviously become a CEO, right? But this was the late 90s and the Kyoto Protocol had just been passed. And I got interested in carbon and climate change. I wanted to learn more. My professors also encouraged me to stay on for a PhD. But when I explained my focus, carbon, this was met with blank stares. What aspect of carbon will you be focused on? One professor asked. You need a specialty like economics or operations research or policy, biometrics. And I responded that carbon encompassed all of these and I needed to know them all. So I had the world's largest PhD committee with 2 co-chairs, one in forestry, quantitative resource management, and one in mechanical engineering, because that's where the life cycle assessment research was being done. And I have spent the last 20 years or more focused on the nexus between science and policy and management as it relates to forest carbon and climate change. Needless to say, my niche is in pretty high demand. So I also want to give specifically a shout out to all my women mentors, because they have truly been pioneers in this male-dominated sector. They have paved a road, and I can say that there are now many, many women in forestry. And I am really excited about the young folks. Everyone, all the men and the women, you are all so enthusiastic. You don't have egos, and you have the confidence and to speak up. So be a good teammate and you will go far. Okay, last one. Find your balance. We all need this reminder in an age where we are constantly tethered to our phone 24/7. We're on call, responding to work. No one is productive 24/7. You need to find an outlet to recharge your battery. I've got a few, and it took me a while to realize that they were absolutely essential parts to keep me productive. The first is exercise. I do not do well without daily physical activity. I have early morning running groups and boot camps, and wait for it, I play a lot of tennis. I bet you didn't know that. But my biggest source of stress release is hiking and camping. I read hiking guidebooks to calm me down. I'm dead serious. I have one guidebook that is dog-eared and water-stained, and it's called The Best Hikes with Kids in Western Washington. And I am embarrassed to tell you that I have set a goal that I have to hike all 183 hikes in this book with at least one kid in tow before my youngest turns 18. Yet my kids are super psyched about this. It's a completely random goal, but it guides me through my most stressful times, and it brings me to some incredibly beautiful places in the Pacific Northwest. Which leads me back to forests. They are always the highlight and always the center. I am in awe of their resiliency and their longevity, but I am also in awe of their dynamic nature. And I'm a pragmatist. I'm a pragmatist who wants to figure out how to have 10 billion people living well within the limits of the planet. We cannot do this without harnessing the renewability of trees. We are at a point in time where our population is too large to have inefficient uses of land. This is a reality. So what does this all mean for the forest managers in the room? You are already familiar with trade-offs. So keep focusing on forest health, resiliency, and productivity. Learn from others, including and especially incorporating knowledge of indigenous land management, as well as new innovation. And remember that the world needs forests and renewable resources. So if you harvest, feel proud that you are helping provide the world with an essential good. Is there a way that we can have more wood products and more healthy, resilient, productive forests? Yep, there sure is. Focus on what the atmosphere sees, not the contribution of one particular pathway. Search for the win-wins across time and space. Listen to everyone. Listen to the Native American elders whose knowledge of land goes back centuries. Listen to the kids who know how to program your phone. And listen to the women. They already know how to find the win-wins. They already know about systems thinking, and they care a lot about solving the problem. So back to Ken Kesey and sometimes a great notion. What if we rewrote that ending with a message to the Stamper family? Sometimes you do have to give a inch. Let's rewrite the book and let's put women in charge. All right.
Time for questions. Questions or comments for Edie?
I just wanted to say that that was a really interesting speech of someone that's not in the forestry department for philosophy. But I guess one thing that came to mind was the fact that, as far as I remember, you did not really address how like farming trees and using them or using forest resources in order to provide energy for us to live and other things like that, how that impacts biodiversity and the habitats of like many different species, and also like tree diversity specifically, because if we're planting trees specifically to be used, we're not going to be planting all different types of trees. And when I look up like does logging and does like forestry management reduce the risk of wildfires, it actually doesn't. It, contrary to like something that I think that you mentioned, it when we log, we decrease the trees that keep the undergrowth full, and also the latest crisis in wildfires, most of the land that burned down was like brush and grassland. And I think that creating creating more ways to protect our homes and building them from fires could be a much better solution. So I'm just wondering, like, in response to some of those things, what would
Lots of questions there.
you say?
That's great. And you should come to the forestry school because you will be able to talk about this every single day. And there's just some really, really great questions there and really great information. So some of your questions: how does logging, how does harvesting, how does managing forests impact biodiversity? Super important. So first of all, there are forests of all different types and all different management types and all different species that require different things. So really important is to look at things on a landscape level. So across a landscape, you want to be able to have a wide diversity of different age classes, different openings, different species. All of this is super important. And it's a trade-off, it's a balancing, because we also, just like farming, which by the way, may have been on a forest land and has a totally different impact on ecosystems, it's providing resources that we need. So in any given acre, we're not going to be able to do everything and provide everything. So the key is to look at it globally, look at that whole thing. Are we able to provide enough habitat, enough biodiversity across everything so that we can also provide our resources as well? So that's what I'm talking about, is really, it's like, how can we be more efficient and look at things with a focus on, the reality is we have a lot of people in this world. We have a lot of people in this world. So we've got to figure out how to be efficient with our use of land. You also talked about wildfire, and that's also obviously a really important issue. And I think, again, it really depends on where you are, but it's also very important to understand that there are different forest types and different risks of fire and different management considerations that are really important.
Great talking. One of the points you made that I'd like you to expand on is the point that where forests are more intensively managed, there gets to be more forest. I mean, how can we have more trees by cutting trees? That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, well, so how do you think folks replant trees, or why do you think folks replant trees? Well, here it's it's the law, but it is not the law. It's the law in Washington, it's the law in California. It is not the law in other parts of the world, or even in other parts of the country. And it costs money to do that, but there is an economic value to regrow a forest. And so the more that you have an economic value of growing a forest, the more that you're going to have forests. So the US Forest Service does these RPA assessments, the Resource Planning Act. And in the last Planning Act, they have a whole bunch of different scenarios of like, okay, climate and GDP and population and all of those things. And then they also model like the impact of a higher forest products price with a lower forest products price. And if you isolate all the other pieces except for highest product price and lower product price in the US Southeast, which by the way had been all farmland, and now it's back to a lot of trees. I don't know if you guys have been in the Southeast. There are a lot of trees in the Southeast. My family plants trees. It used to be an abandoned rice plantation. So the difference between these two are with the high forest products price and the lower one are 9 million acres of forest land.
More forest.
Higher forest price, more forest land. That's a lot of carbon, by the way, because the main thing you can do from a carbon perspective is just have the forest versus not having a forest.
Yeah.
So I read your post on your site about lengthening rotations and pushing towards away from economic maturity towards biological maturity.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering how important national objective do you think that is, maximizing carbon stocks on the landscape?
That's a great question. Well, so on this, so for those of you who haven't read my blog, so the issue is on whether or not lengthening rotations and managing at the culmination of mean annual increment, which is basically when a tree grows, and it kind of grows in this, like, well, different species grow different ways, but they have periods of time where they grow fast and then they start to kind of sigmoidal off. And if you want to get the most harvest and most carbon, you manage just when that culmination of mean annual increment hits, which is different for different species. So those loblolly pines in the southeast hit that at like age 25, like super young. Out here, Douglas fir, an incredible species, like truly an incredible species, grows really productively, grows a lot, and also is just like the world's best building material. It's a real natural advantage here. So the culmination of mean annual increment for a naturally regenerated Douglas fir is like 80 to 90 years. For intensively managed, where you're managing, fertilizing, genetically improved trees, it's more like 55 years. So it kind of depends on all of this. And I would think, like, I'm gonna say that if you could wave a magic wand and you have that, you're doing exactly what we need, which is more harvest and more carbon in the forest, right? But the key is how you actually get there. And we, as a society, have a whole bunch of different land ownerships and a whole bunch of different forest types. And it's really like the key diversity of all of this that kind of lets us be able to manage for a whole bunch of different things. So we have, different bird species and others that are going to be wanting a certain age class. So, I hesitate to say, like, we need to be doing one particular thing because we don't, because carbon's not going to drive everything. We do need to continue to use wood products. And we do need to also make sure that we have carbon in our forests. So however we can do that is important, as long as we're focusing on other ecosystem services as well.
So can I follow that up?
Yeah.
Just dig a little deeper here.
Yeah.
So assuming there's like, maybe, timber producers are subsidized to grow to longer rotation. You talked a little bit in your article about how that would lead to a short-term dip in supply.
Yeah.
And like, what might that look like just in terms of markets?
Yeah, so that to me would be not good. So that is really important. So how would you make up that supply? That's the real key. And I will tell you right now that the state of Oregon has a lot of trees that are at culmination of mean annual increment right now. So you could bring those online, but you know where they are? You've had 30 years. This has happened. There's been 30 years of delay in a certain segment of land. This is for, all for Washington as well. So if that's truly what is wanting to happen, then the national forests have to come online. They're already managed it. They've got good wood. It's not going to be as many acres, but that's what would have to happen.
Before it burns.
And before it burns, there would be a lot of win-wins, but.
We're gonna go to one online.
Someone online wants to know how you would recommend a young woman forester find a mentor.
Oh. Come to the capstone on May 10th. Yes, do that. There is also join the Society of American Foresters if you have not done that already. If you're in graduate school, join your forestry club, whatever there is, because lots of times you get people coming in And there's also going to be a Women's Forestry Congress this year for the first time ever. And there's going to be a lot of online events as well as in person. So I would do those three things.
Edie, you talked about the importance of using wood in the whole carbon story. Can you touch on how displacement factors would play in there, in that of using wood or not using wood in that carbon? Do you believe that displacement has a benefit?
Yeah. So that's a really important question. And so the idea of a displacement factor is if you are using wood in this building, you know, you're making a building, what would be the alternative material that you would use, and what would be sort of that displacement piece? How much energy did it take to make that alternative material? And then what is the difference in the two? And so it kind of depends on what you're doing right now. So like currently the US for single family homes mostly is built with wood, right? So we are not displacing anything because we're using wood already. But in other parts of the world, wood is not a building material. So there have actually been countries that have done their assessments on like how we can, you know, better meet our goals for climate commitments, and have said, gosh, if we just, you know, build more with wood, we've got a certain amount that we can go towards meeting our commitment. The same is happening here in the commercial buildings and the taller buildings. We are standing in this right now in a mass timber building. So this is really new and it's really exciting concept. And in fact, it is a huge, huge importance in terms of global mitigation, because over the next 30 years, like by 2050, the amount of building stock globally is going to double. So there are actually decisions being made today about the embodied carbon, which is, you know, how much does it take to make that material that goes into that building, that is happening right now. And so we have a really big opportunity to really think carefully, not only in energy use, how things are designed, but also in the materials that are being used.
A lot of people argue that carbon markets and forestry are only a Band-Aid until we get the corporates to stop polluting. You sound like it's part of the long-term answer. So is it a Band-Aid or is it a long-term answer?
Well, so now we're going on another, because carbon markets, I didn't talk at all about carbon markets. No, so natural climate solutions absolutely have to be part of the global solution, right? And within that, there are some places where like it kind of makes sense for there to be an outside payer to, you know, to go through and say, okay, I will pay you to do X, Y, Z. Carbon markets have had a lot of criticism because one, you just mentioned that like it just is giving a free ride for someone to pollute something in the atmosphere. And two, because especially on forests, it's really difficult to figure out what that additional piece is, right? And there's a lot of ways you can slice and dice this. So one of the not necessarily newer things, but there's a lot of emphasis now in looking at things across your entire value chain, of which almost every company eventually is using something that comes from land, and is really looking at, okay, well, what is the impact in my value chain of what's coming from the land? And do I have more opportunity to have better incentives in the materials that I use, which by the way, then would lead you to maybe use more renewable materials, but also make sure that those materials are being done in such a way that has the greatest carbon impact in whatever that may be. So I think carbon on land, natural climate solutions are going to be super important. And whether it's in the form of a straight carbon payment or not is carbon, it's not necessarily the silver bullet per se, but could be for sure part of it.
Thanks, Edie. That was great. So on one of your slides, you had the carbon cycle, sort of global carbon cycle, and you had a circle around the vegetation that kind of blocked the soils.
Oh yeah.
Not
The
soil.
soils,
Yeah.
the soils. Golly.
We point out that the carbon storage of soils is about 3 to 4 times that of the overstory.
For
vegetation.
sure.
Of course, that's both, prairie ecosystems as well as forest ecosystems globally. And then the permafrost soils are even separate.
Oh
But,
my gosh.
but,
Oof.
you really nicely laid out this need to think of things from a systems-based perspective. I think that is absolutely true. And wanting you to talk a little bit more about those other ecosystem services that are provided, because our messaging gets lost somewhere with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because they see cutting edge. I'll just digress for a moment and say I was giving a talk to a group of people that you'd think would be of a like mind. And afterwards, they're like, oh, it's great talks of climate change, of course. Said, but I don't understand how cutting a tree could possibly, result in anything but carbon emissions. Just doesn't make any sense to me. And I thought concrete was the more ecological choice. And I was just blown away because, but we have a lot of work to do on telling a story, but we need to do it in that systems-based perspective, linking in all the ecosystem services provided by forestry. Like you can recreate on a forest, it's managed. You do not recreate in a cornfield, Jen, and store carbon We're actually, there's an area that's clean killed and spinning off carbon because soils are dependent on an influx of carbon from the overstory. And anyhow, if you would speak to sort of that diversity of ecosystem services that need to be taken into account, like that characterize.
Oh man, well, I feel like that's a twofold question because I do want to celebrate soil because soil is super important. And I think there is a lot of opportunity in soil. And one of the reasons why forests have more carbon than other land uses is the carbon that's in the soil from forests. So that's big. And I think there can be more opportunities, both especially on agriculture, but also in forestry to like really harness that and capture that. However, you also know that soil is super complex and super variable. So it's really hard to like have one blanket statement.
Right.
But I appreciate the question about ecosystem services because I have always been told like, oh, well, carbon's like the easy one. Like, you can measure it and you can do it and I'm sitting here thinking like, no, we are not getting this right. And you're telling me this is the easy one? And this is like just one thing, like forests they are not a carbon bank. They are an incredible wealth of everything. They're water regulation, they are soil stability, they're water quality, they provide our drinking water. I mean, they provide habitat of all different types. So this is really important. And I will tell you that there are frameworks with which to look at this. And I think they're kind of two different ways. So one, there's the Millennial ecosystem assessment, which really just categorizes the different ecosystem services. But the sustainable development goals, I think, are ones that are a good one to look at because they do look across all the things that we do and all the different things that we provide, how does it impact the various things? How does it impact water quality? How does it impact habitat? How does it impact education and rural communities and all the workforce development and sanitation? I mean, there's just a whole wealth of things that you have to consider where natural resources fit into all of that. So I think, one, I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, it's really important, and I do want a takeaway to be like, let's think about everything, but also like, don't get too overwhelmed by, by the complexity. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time today. Everybody for coming and joining us, and we appreciate your time today and encourage you to join us on May 10th at the capstone for the Women of Forestry Inspiring Leadership Starker Lecture Series. Thank you.
I have made 4 attempts at my 100th hike, most recently this last Sunday, and I have failed in getting that 100, but I'm almost there. I'm almost to the 100. Oh.